In Chapter 9, we're going to talk about criminal victimization. Now, hidden crimes include crimes that are not reported to the police or ones that are undiscovered. So as we know, the police can only report information to us about the crimes that are known to them. Undiscovered crimes could include things where the victim doesn't even realize they've been victimized, and many of those offenses occur using high technology or illegal access to digital information. Now, how do we know how many people are victimized? We can get this information from several sources. We could get it from the UCR and NIBRS, or we could get it from the NCBS. Now, one of the things that we look at in terms of victimization are the demographic correlates of victimization. And demographics are statistical qualities of a given population. They include things like your sex, your age, your race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And many of these characteristics are significantly correlated with risks of victimization. Now, your typical violent crime victim is somebody who is young, poor, male, and black, and generally living in an inner city or urban area. Now, these characteristics don't explain to us why someone is victimized. Other factors are also playing a role, and that's everything from the region you live in, your socioeconomic status, your family's criminal history, do you live in a single parent household, what kind of parental supervision exists. So people living in urban areas are 150% more likely to be a victim of a violent crime, and those living at or below the poverty line have double the rate of violent victimization. Now, the type of victimization also impacts your likelihood of being victimized. So, for example, young minority women, especially those living with male partners, are more likely to experience domestic violence, while victims of white-collar crimes tend to be older and from a higher socioeconomic status. Now, polyvictimization is also multiple victimization. This is when someone has been a victim of a variety of different types of crimes. This has a more negative impact than being the victim of just one type of chronic victimization by the same offender involving the same type of offense. So children who are polyvictimized also tend to suffer many other adversities. And this in turn leads to a lot of other difficulty or adversity later in life. Everything from illnesses to accidents to unemployment to poverty and incarceration. And this causes considerably more distress than chronic victimization of one type of abuse. Now, re-victimization is the continued victimization by the same offender committing the same crime. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, this does not appear to create the same degree of lasting social and other handicaps as polyvictimization does. Now, we can get some information about victimization from the Developmental Victimization Survey, which was a survey of a little over 2,000 children, and they ranged from ages 10 to 17. And this was done by David Finkelhor, who's a researcher at the University of New Hampshire. Now, they got information on younger children as well, ages 2 to 9, and they got that from their parents or caregivers. 2 follow-up surveys were also conducted, and in total, there was just under 1,000 respondents that took part in all 3 surveys. And they looked at everything from child neglect to bullying to physical abuse and to criminal victimization. Now, they found that there were 4 pathways that led to polyvictimization of children. 1 is living in a dangerous family. 2 is having a family with problems, money problems, employment problems, substance abuse. The 3rd path is living or moving into a dangerous community. And the final path is being a child with pre-existing emotional problems that increase risky behavior. Now, the cost of criminal victimization vary. In terms of just the money that we spend on police, court corrections, that's over $280 billion per year. Now, there's also other effects of crime, those tangible costs of victimization. You need to get your locks changed, or there's medical care that you need. To intangible costs, things like how our behavior changes as a result of being victimized, personal pain and suffering, and lost income. And those costs range anywhere from $690 billion to $3.41 trillion per year. Now, this is one of those charts from your book that really just kind of walks you through what some of those costs of victimization are, both tangible and intangible. Now, crime has a variety of impacts. This also has psychological impacts. This could be everything from trouble sleeping and concentrating to being easily startled. 68% of victims say they experience socio-emotional impacts of crime. And symptoms of stress can also be physical as well as emotional. Now, whether or not you're experiencing those socio-emotional problems can influence whether or not you decide to seek formal help. Many victims reported drinking and smoking more often, feeling isolated, being critical of themselves, the actions they took or failed to take, and being afraid of retaliation. And many of them also wanted to inform the offender of how the crime had impacted them. And here we can see the types of problems and how serious that type of distress is. And here we can also see victim distress by type of crime. Now, physical impacts can be, of course, any type of minor or major injury that you incur, but it's also important to remember that being a victim of a crime can stimulate our fight or flight response. So that includes our blood level adrenaline increasing, our heart rate increasing, hyperventilation, shaking, numbness, crying, dryness of the mouth, and a sense that things are in slow motion. And these physical reactions can occur even after victims are safe. Now, there's also an economic impact. Everything from repairs to your property to losses you may have incurred for things that can't be reimbursed or that you can't have insured. But also participation in the justice system can be costly as well. Everything from your transportation to and from court to lost wages to childcare. Other costs could include having to relocate. Your economic productivity at work may suffer. And families of murder victims also have to deal with funeral and burial expenses. Now, these costs are especially difficult for those who are poor, people who are young, and folks who are disabled. Now, there's also social impacts. There's what's called secondary victimization. That's being harmed by going through the process. So that can involve the media being nosy, camping outside your house, asking a lot of questions, media coverage of the crime, how the justice system responds to you. Now, that's different from secondary victims. Those are the people who are not the direct victim of the crime, but are the loved ones of a victim of crime who may also be impacted by that crime. Now, victimization also creates a risk factor for becoming involved in crime. Now, when we talk about women in particular, we can see this happen through this indirect pathway. So sexual abuse often leads young women to run away from abusive homes. Now, while they have run away, they may engage in crimes that we refer to as survival crimes. They may be stealing things. They may be prostituting themselves in order to have money to support themselves. They could also be reacting to being pushed, slapped, beaten, or otherwise threatened. Now, the justice system often ignores this piece when it comes to women. And so the role that original victimization played is often sort of discounted. Now, victimology is a field of study, and we have a course here, CJ 312, which is called Society and Victims of Crime, which is a victimology course, and it's the study of victimization, okay? It's helping us understand why certain groups are more likely to become victims. Now, this helps us understand how we can best respond to this. And one thing that's really important to remember is that we're never blaming the victim, okay? We're trying to understand how they came to be victimized, but that doesn't mean they're responsible for their victimization. So victimogenesis is the origin or cause of victimization. And early on, victimologists classified the degrees to which victims contributed to their own victimization, and they came up with their own typologies. Now, one thing that was broken down was victim proneness and victim precipitation. Victim proneness is your likelihood of being a victim. How prone are you to being victimized? Whereas victim precipitation is the contribution you made to the criminal event, and usually refers to the fact that the person who ends up victimized is the person who started the altercation. Now, this can be passive. You unknowingly encourage an offender, or you could literally start a fight that leads to you being killed or victimized. Now, there's different ways we contribute to our victimization. Sometimes we facilitate it. We leave our doors unlocked and we don't take simple precautions. Sometimes we provoke it. We're the initial aggressor. We might start a fight that ends in our death. Or they could initiate it. You attract the offender's attention. You're hiking alone on an isolated trail. But again, remember, we're not blaming the victim here. We want to examine factors that could have contributed to this victimization. Now, there are several researchers here, and the most famous and well-known one is Marvin Wolfgang. And Wolfgang studied victim precipitation, and he tells us that about 26% of homicides are the result of active victim precipitation, with alcohol playing a key role. Now, Mendelssohn develops a 6-part typology ranging from a completely innocent victim to an imaginary victim. And he says that only the completely innocent victim is truly blameless. Others either have minor guilt, equal guilt, or more guilt than the offender. Now, Hans von Henting looked at a 13 category. All I could see is the word taxonomy, so now I can't think of typology is the word I was looking for. Looking at psychological, social, and biological factors. And he included things like the lonesome and heartbroken, the greedy. Chaper focused on the functional responsibility of victims and had a 7-category typology based on the degree of provocation. Now, Amir found that 19% of forcible rapes involved female victims, and they were caused by either the use of alcohol, seductive behavior, or provocative clothing. Now, clearly, this has ventured beyond the looking at how a victim played a role in their victimization to blaming the victim. And this research has been intensely criticized. But today we're still looking at things like this. So there is some research that tells us whether or not you might be mugged could be based on how you walk. A slow and unsteady gait sends a message that you are unable to escape and or defend yourself. Now, we can also look at victimization and lifestyle theories. Okay, and we've got lifestyle theories here and routine activities approach, and these develop in the 1970s. Now, lifestyle theory looks at your lifestyle. How does your repetitive pattern, regular events that you engage in every day perhaps put you at higher risk? Do you work a late night shift in a crime-prone area? Do you routinely withdraw large sums of cash from the same ATM? If so, you may be placing yourself at risk for certain types of victimization. Now, some groups also live very risky lifestyles. Homeless, runaways, heavy drinkers. And certainly, being a criminal yourself would increase your victimization. Then some people are also at heightened risk because they're young or intellectually or physically challenged or the elderly. Now, another theory looks at routine activities. And routine activities theory says we need 3 things to be present in order for a crime to occur. We need a motivated offender, a suitable target, and an absence of capable guardians. Now, when those 3 things converge together, you're likely to have a crime. So, for example, your risk of victimization increases if you are a member of a racial or ethnic minority who ventures out in public at night in dangerous areas without family or friends while carrying valuables or engages in risk-taking behavior. Now here we see that motivated offender, suitable target, absence of a capable guardian. Where those 3 connect, we're likely to see criminal activity. Now the upside of this means that if we tweak one of those elements, we should be able to decrease the likelihood of a crime. We can prevent crime by doing what's called target hardening. Now, interestingly enough, there is research that tells us that things like metal detectors, security guards, and school patrols do not prevent school crime. Now, Deviant Places theory says that there are certain places where there is a lot of victimization, and that happens a lot in socially disorganized areas. And the focus here is on the geographic area as opposed to the people who actually live there. Now, certain neighborhoods increase the risk of victimization, and those stigmatized neighborhoods are usually characterized by crowded homes, transience, dilapidation, and a lack of successful role models. Now, if we think about this logically, it kind of makes sense. So when neighborhoods are dense and poor, homes are crowded. When homes are crowded, people tend to hang out outside the home. Crowded homes also mean lower levels of supervision of children and higher levels of family conflict that weakens their attachments and stakes in conformity. So it's important to remember here that this is a theory that's looking at the ecology of the neighborhood or the community, not on the characteristics of the residents. Now, we start to see this focus on victims' right. It's how we're going to transform victim services. And less than 50 years ago, victims didn't really have a role in the justice system. And even today, it's not the victim against the offender. The court case is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus the offender, or the United States of America versus the offender. And in the past, the needs of victims were largely ignored. Now, in 1982, the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime really led to the expansion of victims' assistance programs. Now, the goal of advocacy groups is to have a victims' rights amendment to the Constitution, but there isn't one right now. But 30 states do have their own victims' rights amendments. Sadly, Massachusetts is not one of them. But Massachusetts is very pro-victim. So let's take a quick review of some victims' rights legislation. In 1982, the Victim and Witness Protection Act said judges have to consider victim impact statements at federal sentencing hearings. In 1984, VOCA established crime victim funds, to help states develop victims' assistance or compensation programs. 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act created a federal right of allocution. That's the right to speak for victims of violent and sex crimes. It required federal offenders and child molesters to pay restitutions, and extended rape shield laws at the federal level to civil and criminal cases. And in 1994, VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, really put together funding to address problems like sexual violence and domestic abuse, and today it also includes stalking. So this is where a lot of funding for hotlines, victim compensations, and advocacy for domestic violence and sexual abuse victims comes from. The Patriot Act did amend VOCA to make victims of terrorism eligible, and the 2004 Crime Victims' Rights Act established statutory rights for victims of federal crimes and gave them authority to ensure their rights are provided in federal court. Now, restorative justice is the idea of making the victim whole again. And the idea is also to hold the offender accountable, but also bring him or her back into society after they've been held accountable. Now, it has an offender accountability piece, a victim reparation piece, and a community safety piece. So what we want is the offender to leave the system more capable of participating in society than they were when they entered the system. We also want to make the victim whole again. So this could include things like restitution. These are court-ordered payments that offenders make to victims, or they make them to a general fund, and then that fund is monies that is dispersed towards victims. It's designed to reimburse victims for damages and or losses. In these victim compensation programs, though, when the offenders pay into a victim's comp program, which we'll talk about in a minute, then victims are eligible to apply to that fund. They might also be ordered to perform some type of service, community service, or service directly to the victim. As I mentioned, victims' compensation is a payment made by state and local government. So usually you need to have reported your crime and met some other criteria, and then you could be reimbursed. So we talked a little while ago about some of the financial harms that may come to a victim of crime. Maybe you have to replace the locks on your home. maybe you have to get something replaced, you have to have dental work done or medical work, you could apply to be reimbursed from this victim's compensation fund. Now, we've also seen a lot of social movements. These are groups that organize around a theme, and we've seen them organize around different victims' rights movements. And this can also lead to a lot of change. Most of these changes that happened in 70s, 80s, and 90s for victims came about as a result of this type of advocacy. And that wraps up our chapter.